Rose Murphy was 73 years old when she learned the truth about Table 7. She was sitting in her small apartment in Coral Gables, Florida, watching the evening news, when the reporter mentioned that this was the 50th anniversary of Al Capone's death. They showed an old photograph, and Rose dropped her coffee cup. The nice old man who'd sat at Table 7 every morning for 3 years in the 1940s, the man who always ordered black coffee and wheat toast, the man who called her sweetheart and left dollar tips when most people left nickels, the man who'd asked about her children and remembered their names, that man had been Al Capone. Rose had served coffee to the most notorious gangster in American history, and she'd never known it. This is her story, told the way she remembered it, 40 years after the fact. A story about what happens when the most feared man in America becomes just another regular customer, looking for nothing more than a quiet cup of coffee and a moment of ordinary kindness. The Seashell Diner sat on Collins Avenue in Miami Beach, 3 blocks from the ocean. It wasn't much to look at. 12 tables, red vinyl booths, and a counter with 8 stools. The coffee was strong, the food was simple, and the prices were fair. In 1944, that was enough. Rose Murphy had been working there for 6 years. She was 38 years old, a widow with 2 boys to raise. Her husband had died in a factory accident in 1939, and the insurance money hadn't lasted long. The job at the Seashell paid $30 a week plus tips, enough to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. Rose was good at her job. She remembered how people liked their coffee. She knew which customers wanted to talk and which ones preferred to be left alone. She could carry 4 plates at once and never spilled a drop. But more than that, she treated every person who walked through that door like they mattered. My mother always said you can tell a person's character by how they treat the waitress, Rose would say years later. I made sure people had a reason to treat me well. The Seashell attracted a mix of customers, construction workers grabbing breakfast before their shifts, elderly retirees who came in for the early bird specials, tourists stopping for directions, and regulars, the people who came in so often they didn't need to look at the menu. In September of 1944, a new regular appeared. He was an older man, probably in his mid-40s, though he looked older. He was heavy-set, well-dressed, but not flashy. He moved slowly, carefully, like someone whose body wasn't keeping up with his mind anymore. He always sat at Table 7, the corner booth that faced the door but was tucked away from the main dining area. He always ordered the same thing: black coffee, wheat toast, no butter. He'd sit there for exactly 30 minutes, reading the Miami Herald from front to back, then he'd pay his check and leave. Rose noticed him because he was different from their usual customers. His clothes were expensive, real silk ties, custom-made shirts, shoes that probably cost more than she made in a month. But he wasn't showy about it. He dressed like a man who'd learned that quality mattered more than flash. "Good morning," Rose said the first time she approached his table. "What can I get you started with?" He looked up from his newspaper. His eyes were dark, tired but kind. "Black coffee, sweetheart, and 2 pieces of wheat toast. No butter." His voice was softer than she'd expected. There was an accent there, Chicago maybe, but it was gentle, polite. "You got it," Rose said. "You new to the area?" He nodded. "Just moved down from up north. Still getting used to the sunshine." That was all he offered, and Rose didn't push. Some people came to Florida to escape something. She'd learned not to ask too many questions. Within a week, the man at Table 7 had become part of Rose's morning routine. He arrived every day at 8:30 a.m., just after the breakfast rush had died down but before the lunch prep began. He'd nod to Rose, take his seat, and wait for her to bring his coffee. "Regular?" she'd ask, even though she already knew the answer. "You bet, sweetheart." Rose began to look forward to serving him. He was always polite, always patient. If she was busy with other customers, he'd wait without complaint. When she finally made it to his table, he'd smile and ask how her day was going. Most customers fell into 2 categories: the ones who treated waitresses like furniture and the ones who treated them like confessors, dumping all their problems on anyone who'd listen. But Table 7 was different. He treated Rose like a person, someone worth talking to, someone whose thoughts mattered. "You got kids?" he asked one morning in October. "2 boys," Rose said, refilling his coffee cup. "Tommy's 16, Danny's 13. Good ages," he said. "Old enough to help out, young enough to still need their mother. Tommy's got a job after school at the grocery store. Danny's more interested in baseball than work." The man smiled. "Boys need baseball, keeps them out of trouble." Over the following weeks, he'd ask about the boys regularly. How was Tommy doing at the grocery store? Had Danny's team won their game? When Danny broke his arm sliding into second base, Table 7 asked about it every morning until the cast came off. "You're real good with them, aren't you?" he said one day. "Your boys, I mean." Rose paused in wiping down the table. I try to be. It's just me since their father died, so I have to be everything for them. He nodded slowly. That's hard, being everything for somebody else. There was something in his voice when he said it. Experience, maybe, or regret. The man at table 7 was generous, but quietly so. His check was usually 60 cents, 30 for the coffee, 30 for the toast. He always left $1. In 1944, that was a substantial tip, enough to make a difference in Rose's weekly take-home pay. But it wasn't just the money. It was the way he treated her. When Rose came to work with a black eye in November, she'd walked into a cabinet door in her dark kitchen. Most customers either stared or pretended not to notice. Table 7 looked at her with concern. "You all right, sweetheart?" he asked. "Just clumsy," Rose said. Walked into a door. He studied her face for a moment, then reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small bottle of aspirin. "My wife swears by these," he said. "Take a couple with your coffee. Helps with the ache." Rose wanted to refuse. She couldn't take medicine from a customer. But something in his eyes told her he understood about pain, about trying to work when your body was fighting you. "Thank you," she said, accepting the bottle. When she tried to return it the next day, he waved her off. "Keep it. Everyone should have aspirin around." For 3 months, Rose knew him only as the man at table 7. He paid in cash, never used a credit card or wrote a check. She'd started thinking of him as Mr. 7 in her head. It wasn't until January of 1945 that she learned his name, and even then it was by accident. Rose was taking his order one morning when another customer, a loud businessman from New York, recognized him. "Hey, aren't you Joe Capone?" the businessman said, walking over to table 7. "I thought that was you. Joe Capone, right?" The man at table 7 looked uncomfortable, but he nodded. "That's right. I knew it," the businessman said. "You used to run numbers in Chicago, didn't you? My cousin Tony used to work for your brother." "That was a long time ago," Mr. 7 said quietly. The businessman kept talking, but Rose had stopped listening. Joe Capone, the name meant nothing to her. It was just a name, like Smith or Jones. She filed it away and went back to work. But she started thinking of him as Mr. Joe instead of Mr. 7. In March of 1945, Mr. Joe's routine changed. Instead of staying for 30 minutes, he only stayed for 15. Instead of reading the whole paper, he just scanned the headlines. He seemed distracted, worried about something. On a Friday morning in late March, he came in looking pale and unsteady. His hands shook slightly when he lifted his coffee cup. "You feeling all right, Mr. Joe?" Rose asked. He looked up at her, and for a moment she saw something vulnerable in his eyes. Fear, maybe. "Just tired, sweetheart. Haven't been sleeping well. You should see a doctor. You don't look good." He smiled at that. "You're probably right. Maybe I will." He left that morning without finishing his coffee, something he'd never done before. Rose watched him walk to his car, a black Cadillac with a driver, and noticed how slowly he moved, how carefully he had to lower himself into the passenger seat. The next Monday, Mr. Joe didn't come in. Neither did he come Tuesday, or Wednesday, or the rest of the week. Rose found herself looking toward the door at 8:30 every morning, expecting to see him. She never saw him again. For 40 years, Rose wondered what had happened to the nice man who'd sat at table 7. She'd retired from the Seashell in 1963, gotten remarried to a good man named Frank, and watched her boys grow up and have children of their own. She'd think about Mr. Joe sometimes, the polite gentleman who'd treated her with respect when many customers treated waitresses like servants. She hoped he'd found whatever he was looking for when he moved to Florida. Then came January 25th. Rose was watching the news when the reporter mentioned that it was the 50th anniversary of Al Capone's death. They showed the famous mugshot first, the young, glowering face that everyone associated with Chicago's most notorious gangster. Then they showed a later photograph taken sometime in the 1940s. An older man, heavier, wearing an expensive suit and looking tired. Rose's coffee cup slipped from her hands. The face in that photograph was the face of the man who'd sat at table 7. The man who'd asked about her boys. The man who'd given her aspirin when she had a black eye. The man who'd called her sweetheart and left dollar tips. Mr. Joe Capone. Al Capone. Rose sat in her living room for 2 hours, staring at the television even after the news had moved on to other stories. Everything she thought she knew about those 3 years suddenly shifted into new focus. The expensive clothes made sense now. The driver. The way he always sat facing the door. The fact that he'd paid in cash and never given his full name. But what didn't make sense was everything else. Al Capone was supposed to be a monster, a killer, a man who ruled Chicago through fear and violence. The man Rose had known was nothing like that. She thought about all their conversations, about how he'd asked about her boys with genuine interest, about how he'd worried when Danny broke his arm, about how he'd given her medicine when she was hurting. That man, the man who treated her like a human being worth caring about, that man had been Al Capone? That evening, Rose called her son Tommy. He was 69 now, a grandfather himself, living in Orlando. "Tommy," she said, "do you remember when you were a teenager and I worked at the Seashell Diner?" "Of course, Mom. Why?" "Do you remember me telling you about the nice man who used to come in every morning? The one who always asked about you and Danny?" Tommy thought for a moment. "Sort of. You said he was real polite, always left good tips. That man was Al Capone." Silence on the other end of the line. "Mom, are you feeling all right?" "I'm serious, Tommy. I just saw his picture on the news. It was him. I served coffee to Al Capone every morning for 3 years, and I never knew it." More silence. "Tommy, you still there?" "Yeah, Mom, I'm here. Are you okay with that?" Rose thought about the question. Was she okay with it? "I don't know," she said honestly. "I mean, I know what he did. I know what kind of man he was supposed to be. But the man I knew, Tommy, he was just a customer. A sad, sick old man who was polite to the waitress and asked about her children." In the weeks that followed, Rose found herself thinking about those 3 years in a completely different way. She read everything she could find about Al Capone's later life. His time in prison, his struggle with syphilis, his quiet retirement in Florida. She learned that by the time she'd known him, he was already suffering from the disease that would kill him. His mind was deteriorating. His body was failing. He was just an aging man trying to find some peace in his final years. But Rose also learned about his earlier life. The violence, the corruption, the people who died because of his orders. She couldn't reconcile that man with the one who'd sat at table 7. "Maybe," she told her grandson one day, "people are more complicated than we think. Maybe someone can be a terrible person and a kind person at the same time. Maybe we all have different sides to us." Her grandson, a philosophy student at the University of Florida, nodded thoughtfully. "Grandma, did knowing who he was change how you felt about those mornings?" Rose considered the question carefully. "No," she said finally. "It didn't change how I felt. It just made me realize that I never really knew who anybody was. All those years serving coffee to hundreds of people, and I only knew the face they showed me for 30 minutes at breakfast." Rose Murphy died in 2003, at the age of 97. In her final years, she would often tell the story of serving coffee to Al Capone, but she never told it as a sensational anecdote. She told it as a lesson about the complexity of human nature. "People always want to know if I was scared when I found out," she would say. "But how can you be scared of someone after they're dead? And besides, the man I knew, the man who sat at table 7, he wasn't scary. He was just lonely." She never romanticized what Al Capone had done in his younger years. She understood that he'd been responsible for terrible things, but she also understood that at the end of his life, he'd been just another customer looking for a little ordinary kindness in a world that had mostly forgotten how to offer it. "I've served coffee to thousands of people," Rose would say. "Rich ones, poor ones, famous ones, nobody ones. And you know what I learned? Everybody just wants to be treated like they matter. Everybody wants someone to remember how they take their coffee." The Seashell Diner closed in 1987. The building is now a parking lot. Table 7 no longer exists, but the lesson it taught still does, that we never really know the full story of the people we encounter in our daily lives. We only know the 30 minutes they spend at our table, the face they choose to show us, the small kindnesses we exchange. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's everything. And sometimes, 40 years later, you learn that the nice old man who always left dollar tips and asked about your children was one of the most notorious criminals in American history. But by then, what matters isn't who he was to the world. What matters is who he was to you. Rose Murphy served Al Capone coffee for 3 years and never knew it. But Al Capone found a place where he could be just another customer, just another aging man looking for a quiet moment in his day. In those final years of his life, maybe that's all he really wanted to be.